right. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome. I know this seems a little odd to do this remote. I was looking forward to a trip to Portland, but next year, let's save the faith. So today, my talk is about key observations and trends in the test automation market that I've seen. So a little aspect about me is that I've worked as a director and vice president in manager in automation and in quality assurance in general, but I've also worked on the vendor side. For a couple of different automation firms. So I got to see a little bit of different world from their perspective, and then the project perspective of implementation. So these are things that I've always tried to stay on top of the market, to look at tooling, trending, and what have you. So today's presentation is really to talk about some of the trends that I've seen and some of the people that I've kind of watched talking about the same. So the agenda today, first, it's important to me to talk about some historical trends and industry analysis. Looking at the history kind of leads you to think where you're going in the future. Impacts from software delivery and constant evolution of the automation market. It's a never-ending evolving trend. The universe, 5 key trends that I feel to be watching for. Future predictions. And then finally, just a recap. So with that, I'll get started. All right, some historical trends and industry analysis. And by the way, any questions along the way, please feel free to ping. We can keep it as conversational. I'd like to keep to some of the topics as is. Sophia, is there a recommendation for how we handle questions?
Yes, sure. So during the talk, I'll be monitoring the chat. Okay. So if you're open to, answering questions, I'll let you know. I'll stop you, ask the questions so you can answer live, and then we continue.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, I'd love that. And then I'll still save time at the end for any questions, comments, things like that.
Perfect.
All right. So let's jump in. So historical perspective on automation. So first, record and playback tools. If anyone, maybe I'm dating myself, but when we had tools, there were a handful of tools way back when that really focused on record and playback, right? And so it never really lived up to the hype as doing just that. So it was really to test Windows applications, right? I remember back in the day that you can test, how cool is that to test a broken link for a URL, but not really dig into the objects. I mean, again, dating myself, but it's important to show kind of how the evolution, where it started from. So we really found tools like Windrunner or Silk or IBM Rational. Some of these tools, CompuWare, QA Run. So some of these tools had to go in and do some programming just to make the scripts work. And they found that to be more, this is where the required skill set was. So you see some of the automation engineers having more development background. So some of the frameworks that evolved kind of looked like this. There was a record and playback. That didn't quite work. There was more structured testing where we're invoking conditions with some coded classes and some functions that are being written. Then there was a concept of doing some data-driven testing. Again, we don't like our developers to hard code data, so we started abstracting a little bit more of the data to maintain that in a separate location as opposed to the testing logic. Then there was a more approach where the automation engineers were building this keyword approach where you saw the end user was trying to make use of given keywords so people can make use of that. A lot easier to maintain the automation. More model-based testing as well. So now we see some tooling and trends try to get to some of them on model-based test. Then finally, some more actions-based. So that can encompass, in today's world, that can encompass UI testing or it can encompass API testing. Or maybe, as some people will put it, a hybrid. But it's a continual push. We saw that with record and playback. We saw that it really didn't work. We tried to market to functional testers who didn't have a programming background, and the industry went away from that, with the advent of, using Selenium, using HP, some of those stuff where you have to have some coding background to build that framework properly. It's all to bring it back so the functional testers who have the testing knowledge to have them contribute to automation. So some industry analysis on the automation market. There's an author I like to follow, Joe Antonio, probably the Test Automation Guild. I like to see the things that he's always producing. I think he's one of the thought leaders in the field. So there's an article he wrote that I thought was really interesting. It's to say, what automation engineers struggle with. So current trends are going to help with previous struggles here. Test script maintenance will get easier. I mean, boy, for all the automation folks we have on the call, doesn't it sound wonderful? To make sure that we need to get script maintenance easier, especially if you're doing some UI type testing. The objects are not broken, and then you have a reliable paths to get to that object each time. An API that the contracts are not being broken by developers, that you have the same contract agreement each time. Boy, that'd make things, the scripts, a lot easier. Automation tools, self-healing will arise. So yeah, there's a lot of tools now that are talking and building in that concept of self-healing because the market is asking for it. The market is demanding that we have some kind of self-healing capability for tools to be able to work with and say, how do you base it on a set of criteria? You have one criteria that you're looking for. Let's say from a UI perspective, now you're going to criteria 2, 3, 4, whether that's hitting the accessibility layer, whether that's hitting the, any kind of OCR type of mentality. It's something that tooling is expected to deliver on more and more. So AI is going to help report on automated test runs and analysis. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I bet you some folks on this call, I'd be interested to hear that. I'm sure people are starting to try to build in some type of AI capability within their automation solution. Non-Selenium automation-based tools will gain in popularity. It's starting to get there. It's certainly not to say that Selenium is on the down curve by any means. Not even saying that at all. But there's tools that are trying to adopt some of the Selenium-based approach and even kind of build on top of that to build a framework that's more supported. Record and playback will rise again. I will tell you, I believe when I saw this, I couldn't agree with Joe more because the record and playback of yesteryear, which is why I showed it in a historical, is not like today's record and playback. The way that a lot of the tools parse out the object repository information versus the test logic is pretty slick. And I think that's the way it needs to go. And additionally, when you look at some API level tools or API level testing, some tools are actually recording the UI traffic and putting that into a API test. That is some thought leaders right there. In my mind, that you don't have to have necessarily right off the bat API testing knowledge. You're recording your traffic like you're recording just a test, but it's generating it as an API level, a series of tests for you. The new buzz phrase, continuous testing. I mean, we love having this whole continuous everything, right? Continuous development, continuous integration. Now, why not we have one for continuous testing? So yeah, I thought Joe did a pretty good job of encapsulating this, and I agreed with these points, and I thought he hit it. What I was trying to get the message across in some of the future trends that I see. All right, so yeah, unless there's any questions, comments along the way, I will just keep going. So some delivery impacts and constant evolution. I hate to do it. I hate to talk waterfall, but I am sure there are plenty of people on this call. If I ask you if you're doing pure agile development, true to its form, you're probably going to tell me that you're doing agile-ish or agile fall or water agile. I've heard a lot of the culmination of those words together. And it's true because I think there's some aspects, I'm sure, of our delivery that still have waterfall feel to it. So I don't know if I'll ever be able to. I've thought about this on presentations that I do. I'm like, I don't know if I could ever purely eliminate the waterfall concept because it's just we're not fully there. Is there a question?
Yes, Jim, from Chris. I think he's referring to the previous slide, or you were showing the current trends. He asks if you can give an example of what self-healing means.
Sure, absolutely. So I really refer to that, Chris, more on the UI level. So in my mind, self-healing, when we look at UI kind of object recognition, we look at a certain path and a certain attribute to get to that UI object. Well, something's changed. There's new requirements and there's something changed on that screen. That element has gone to another screen or has changed. It's dynamic in nature. There's different things that are collected about it. So even though you have a path about it, it's taken other attributes to say, what is it? It's an OK button. Do we have OCR type of mentality? It's also got this label. It's got this class ID. It's got this, it's looking at various levels of not only maybe XPath, but CSS selectors, any kind of DOM elements that may be registered for that. So it's taken into account, like prioritizing, if I can't find this path, the object on this path, what's my next level of priority? What's my next level? What's my next level? And going down to sometimes 6 or 7 levels down to make sure that if your first path failed, I can use my second and third options to find that one reliably. If that helped answer the question. I'll wait a minute to see, Chris, if that did.
Yeah, he says makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's pretty slick. I mean, there's a lot of them. I like, that's the kind of stuff I like hearing because I hear all the time. I'm in meetings just every day where I hear about, we got to get away from UI testing. It's flaky. It's this. I'm like, it is. And I like API testing as a more reliable way to do it, but it doesn't mean that for the needs that we have to do UI testing, it has to be flaky. So I like watching trends in this area. All right, so let me go on to talk about waterfall for a brief moment. So let's ask our questions. We want to automate new features or regression. If it's new features, when do we automate within the build? I mean, sometimes I hate even talking about waterfall, but it's going to resonate with some people because we just don't have the luxury of fully going away from it because I think we have some of our agile work that is kind of waterfallish. When do you automate within the build? And more specifically, were the test cases written with automation in mind? It's to that point where we've got to get away, I think, as an industry to say, automation engineers, take these 50 test cases in the regression and go automate them. Because anytime, in my experience, anytime I've seen that, majority of the time, it's the automation engineer has more questions on it than actually being able to just go do it because of how they're necessarily written. And it's not because the functional tester wrote them poorly. You just don't write them with automation in mind at the time they're written. Some of these regression cases are significantly old, but they do the job. All right, so going into these agile cycles, this is the big one. Which sprint do you automate in? And I'd be curious, what kind of feedback we have from the audience. What do you believe? Are you doing N and then N-1, N-2, or a dedicated regression or automation sprint? A previous company I was at had a dedicated regression sprint. So, whether that was the right way to do it or not, but it helped shed some light on what we needed to do for regression until we could get to such point of time to start factoring that in more into the actual feature sprints. But, some companies, we weren't there yet. But I don't, in this regard, and I don't have a preference. I used to think it's always better to do N. And sometimes if we can get to that point, it is. It's almost like that, like being a TMMI to me. If you don't have the desire to get to a TMM level 5, and there's no real critical need for you to do that, then maybe that's not the best measurement for you. So I'd be curious, how are people doing this? Do you find yourself doing more N, N-1, N-2, or something like that dedicated automation sprint or regression sprint? I'll wait a sec just to get some feedback I'm curious of. If you wouldn't mind replying in the chat.
So I think it was Chris again who, sure. He says they're doing N. but it's always lag. So it has to be an N+2 or +3.
Hey, Chris, you're up, but keep striving. I know you're trying for the best. And I'm always, I'm always trying to be optimistic too, to try to get it in the N level, but I don't want it. Oh, that's interesting. I don't want it to look like a failed sprint because we didn't do that. If we dedicate this as a primary story for an N-1 sprint, I'm okay with that. Just like I am sure everyone on this call has dealt with the ratio question, right? We got to make sure we have the right number of QA ratio to dev ratio. Sometimes I'm done fighting that fight. It's like I can show them industry analysis and blah, blah, blah that say that maybe 10 or 12 developers to one tester is not a good idea. But you get that to the point.
If you have any resources for that, would you please share that? That would be amazing.
Yeah, Eddie, I'll certainly try. I mean, it was just, at some point, I've tried to look up those kind of industry numbers, and I don't want to say I've taken that automation with sprint mentality, but because it's a little less, but I just want to make sure it's some negotiation. I mean, in QA, I think we're the best negotiators our industry has to offer, period. We're doing so much bartering and everything. And if I have to concede on N level to do N-1, then I'm going to say that's fine, but we are going to make this, and this has got to be a top priority for the N-1. And this is what succeeds. Now, in N-1, we cannot succeed this. We can't pass this sprint unless these automation tests are done. So ideally it would be N, but I'd rather have good quality code that we could automate on and even slightly stable than just trying to get it done in N when the developer may have just completed it, a day or two before the sprint. Just my take. Well, thanks for the feedback, everyone. And then we go to this wonderful world of DevOps. The pyramid, you knew at some point I had to throw in that pyramid, the wonderful world here. Really trying to hone in on where we can emphasize more on those unit tests and really even on those API tests. But we've got to move more towards this API testing. And I'll tell you, I was probably one of the slowest proponents of that. I didn't understand for a while why we couldn't just do it all through the UI. It's exercising the user experience, and the API is just sitting underneath that. Why do we have to exercise on the API layer? I have been slower to that take, but I am fully on board. When I really see some of the metrics and see what we're doing with more of the API testing, I'm like, yeah, I'm in. It took me a little slower. So for those who are used to just doing full UI, there's a lot of argument to be had for making this API level test. It just deals with a lot of, they have to deal with some of that flakiness. So I'll give you an example. Different organizations I've been at, we've had some even Lotus Notes applications at different organizations. We've had some older VB6 that we've migrated to a new world, to the Java world, to .NET, to, anything on, any newer technology in the IDEs. Automation will die going across, and the much refactoring, even though the business logic hasn't really changed. So, and they're trying to port over those same, some functions and same methods that we could have captured with API testing. So yeah, I'm fully on board with API testing. I think there's a place for UI testing, exercising some of the user experience, but not necessarily all of the data logic. And that's the kind of approach we're trying to do. We exercise one set of persistent data across that's exercising the controls, buttons, just to make sure that it's displaying properly. And that's more the breadth of testing, and the depth of testing, we're doing more end-to-end testing with our APIs.
There's a question, Jim. Who
Sure.
does the API tests?
So what we try to do is that's still our QA engineers working with our automation engineers, but it's really, really for the developers to produce those JSON files, or that's especially the Swagger documentation. If they could get anything like that where we could import it in, it makes the API world so much easier. And for those people who haven't done API testing, honestly, work with your developer. If you can work with a tool that has an API kind of import, I don't really consider that this could be debatable, but in my mind, I don't really consider Postman an automation solution. It's certainly good for doing manual API testing, but I would really put that on the automation engineer to understand a little bit better, work with your developers to say the data attributes that you're going to see and the data that passes in from your payload, you're going to be able to understand it, I think, better than you might think you can. But still, I would, on the first couple, I'd work with your developer to understand where these data points, and you can build your data-driven strategy off that. It could be straightforward once you have an understanding kind of how it works. But the Swagger, especially if they have those definition files done that you could import it, that's what makes it good. And that's what makes it more to the microservice level of making sure that we have testing encapsulated fully with that microservice. So I haven't really touched on microservice, but really on the API level, that's where it would go. All right, let me go on. All right, changes requiring constant evolution. Faster cycles require faster automation. They can break easily, and changing technology stacks. So let me go into the 5 key trends that I got here. Environment considerations. So open source, framework expansion, functional testers creating automation, and vendors leased license models. And that'll be one that you might not have thought of, and I want to make sure we discuss that. Environment considerations. So we have these test environments now. There's a lot of cloud providers for test environments. And so for us, we're using a cloud solution provider for our automation environments, where our automation reaches out to one of the cloud hosted models solutions, runs the tests, and we get the reports back. And we know the usage. It's a whole bunch of VMs out there. So the pipeline from our environment goes out to the cloud, and that hosted environment comes back with automation results. So it seems to be much more of a trend on test environments, as opposed to old school saying, I'm going to host my own VMs. I'm going to spin up these VMs for my automation. I'm going to be doing this in my environment, work with my VMware administrator and make sure we get these up, make sure it's got the right RAM and processor and disk space available. So automation scripts are loaded up to the cloud environment. Scripts are executed in a one-to-many. So there's a lot of, there's some slick companies out there that are doing some of this hosted model really well, that are probably doing it much better than what I could have done independently with building my own kind of thing. So it's a buy versus kind of build concept. The whole concept of deploying and destroying and then restarting that environment again. So Sophia, please, ping me and if there's any questions.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thanks. So that's one that, again, people may be going into, but I'm seeing more companies starting to build up this capability on the market to give that to folks. So you don't have to try to provision your own. How many servers do you need? How many, processors? What kind of VM environment do you need? And what kind of virtual environments? What's the number you're going to need next year? Just go buy a certain threshold from a vendor. So vendors align with open source solutions. So test automation competition previously. So when I was working for an automation vendor was 2014, 15, and 16. I built my pitch tool and my pitch deck. I was an account executive, so I built my pitch deck to go against the open source solutions. It was to say how we on the commercial side are better than what those open source solutions are. The open source solution in question, as I'm sure we all know, Selenium, is the granddaddy of them all. And instead of folks, there's other open source solutions that are certainly have come to market as well, but that's definitely the most popular. with that, we would try to do a competition, or vendors were trying to compete against that. Now, it's not like that anymore. They finally realized, like, hey, you know what? People are using these products, something like a selenium or Appium. And how do we align with that? So the commercial tools are not necessarily competing against it, still kind of are, but they're actually sitting on top of that kind of framework. So they're leveraging that. So if you have written 5,000 Selenium test cases, you can make use of these in these new commercial tools. So it's more alignment with these tools, and you're going to see a lot more tools that talk about, hey, we integrate with Selenium, we work with Selenium, we work with Appium, we work with maybe Cypress, something where we're talking about how they can work with these open source models. Again, if I go back to that historical trend, it's to make it easier for the functional testers to do more automation, even though the underlying framework that you've developed is pretty technical in nature.
Jim, we have another question from the audience.
Sure.
This was regarding the previous topic that you touched on cloud environment.
Okay.
Do you have any recommendations on cloud environments you've used that companies offer?
I can tell you some that I've watched in the market without, again, I'm trying to stay impartial. So maybe, you know what, maybe ping me afterwards. I don't necessarily want to give any kind of product plug for anything, even though we're trying to do that.
If you just leave your maybe Twitter or email address that they can contact you. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll be happy to share. But yeah, there's different. I can give you some some that I've been in contact with. Some like a Browser Stack, Sauce Labs, Lambda Test. Those are to name a few that I know of on the market. So take a look at some of those kind of capabilities. I'm sure there's others that I'm missing. So if anyone has any, I'd be interested in hearing that. But yeah, again, I'm not trying to position any solution, but yeah, there are solutions that are, those three are some that come right off the top of my head. Okay. So let me move on. All right. Framework collaboration is going fast. All right. So we had a test automation tool before, right? So we've got this tool. What does that mean? Now everything had to go integrate. How do you integrate with that tool before? So it was the test automation tool was that center. And now how do we align all these other solutions to work with it? They're expanded. So when you look at a test automation company now, there are very, very few that are just test automation. And I think it's really interesting to watch. They're trying to take the whole gamut in mind for the functional team to address all their questions. Look at where you have your test automation primary solution. They have integrations with test management, with different CI/CD pipelines, analytics, your mobile providers, any kind of other specialty automation, maybe for, some impairment, certainly like that for accessibility, UI analyzer solutions, cloud environments, performance testing. You see these tools are now partnering together. They're getting to be one kind of conglomerate of solutions. So when you take a look at some commercial tools, if you look at other products in their pipeline, yeah, there's a lot. So it's interesting to say they want to be that one-stop shop to say, come here, which is not a bad thing to do. Come here, look at all the products that we have that will solve your needs. It certainly saves some quality managers time to go research other solutions and then trying to figure out how they tie together. All right. Coming now, functional testers making the comeback. We've heard, how many people have heard before that functional testers have to think about getting all development skills, to be able to be an automation engineer, because the role of manual testing is going to be going by the wayside. We've been hearing that for a while, and I'm not saying that that the manual testers shouldn't get more technical. I think one key area, if you haven't gone there enough, is really on that API testing and working with your development team. I think they're going to appreciate that even much more than you could possibly imagine. So creating automation. For illustrative purposes, just some of the research that I've done. And again, you guys may see it. We may see some percentages a little different than mine, but I don't think it's going to be drastically off. Just based on research I've done over the last few years, we still, of all testers, I'm saying still 3 out of 4 are automation engineers, even on different companies I've been at, versus automation engineers. I'm sure I've heard some environments that have much more automation engineers and fewer functional testers. I think that's really cool. I haven't seen that as a majority. So I'd be curious on people's feedback on this to say, do you see something close to those percentages? Are you trending downward for your functional testers? While I go on, I'd love for you guys to give any kind of feedback on that. But that's, again, what I've seen. So we're talking about this for functional tester. It only makes sense why we would try to bring automation more for functional testers to create automation. The SDETS automation engineers serve a vital role in trying to deliver that for automation engineers to help create the tests.
Jim, there's a question from Chris. To clarify, when you say functional tester, do you mean manual tester?
Yes. Yeah. Chris, I've always liked the word functional tester, but yes, as a manual tester. But I think of our manual test community to be more technically skilled than what they get credit for. So me personally, it's just my little hang up. I like saying functional tester, but yes, translate to a manual tester. All right, so let me go back to this. They're actually asked to do both, and I'm sure people are seeing this. They're becoming a hybrid. They're asked to do both roles, sometimes on the same project, and that makes it a challenge. Automation engineers, and I've watched this when we're asking our vendor teams, automation engineers, they want to do automation. Functional testers, they want to stay in their testing world. They don't want to learn how to program. So it's kind of like we're pushing sometimes people to do these trends that they may not want to do. So some key advancements for this. Code generation from recordings. So the record and playback concept is really important to me for one aspect. It generates code. For a lot of these tools, it generates code in the background. So that doesn't mean that I believe in recordings full throttle, but that doesn't mean I believe in playback from that recording. I believe there's a way to go in, record, harden that code, where the automation engineer can do that and then make it usable for the manual tester or your functional tester. But now that automation engineer doesn't have to try to decipher what did they mean by this recording. You know it. Here's my steps. We just have to make sure that this script is hardened. Codeless automation. Number of tools are trying to continually push this, and they're getting better and better at it. I don't know if it's fully there yet. It's getting really close. There's a number of tools that have popped up on the market that really claiming to do this well. And I haven't researched every one of these tools. So I've gone through a number of them, and they're pretty slick as well. Easy API schema review. So a way that here's the definition file, make it easy. So now, a customer API, and it's got in your payload, it's got your address field, city, state, zip, name, and just things that make it seem very, very straightforward for the functional tester to be able to work with. Okay, I understand that. Now how do I data drive that? But a schema that's easy to review. Script self-healing, as I alluded to earlier. Always got to have more AI and kind of machine learning, something that makes it where there's AI type capabilities for there. All right.
Jim, just a reminder, we have 4 minutes left now. Make sure that, you can cover topics that are left. Okay.
So leasing, guys, I want to talk to you about this lease license model for vendors. We used to have the ownership of licenses, and I'll let you guys go through this. You used to have to pay big money up front and get a cap, and go through some capital expenditure, try to get licenses. and you look at some of these in general, now the licenses are much more leased, and it's easier to get into the market because it's usually considered an operating cost as opposed to a capital cost. So you'll see start from year one as a leased cost. So I really think that's important to know, because the days of kind of having to spend $300,000 up front and then pay the renewal each year, it's like basically you're paying the renewal each year from start. So the asset is not necessarily being owned. And I think some of the procurement teams have an easier way to justify getting this through financial boards as opposed to the previous way of owning the license. All right, so future predictions. Must adopt trends. I read this guy, Gaurav Shukla, who had some cool trends. Codeless, investing more in automation, more automation pipelines, blend of continuous testing, API and service level automation, AI and ML. And then finally, I thought this was a cool one, chatbot tests. So a bot to do the automation for you. So automate the automation. I'm like, that was a cool way of thinking. All right, so future predictions that I had here. AI capabilities, we're going to see them become much more stabilized and normalized. A lot of tools are talking about it, but you're going to see that just come more, it's going to be front center. Unit testing frameworks integrate more with automation solutions. So you'll see the various things like Mocha, and just where developers are using some of this, their unit test frameworks integrate more with automation to give you more kind of reporting capability. Data security becomes more prevalent with testing tools, especially non-prod data. So how a testing tool integrates with a test data solution on masking data or giving you some more synthetic data. Automation professionals will blend into operational roles. You know, the whole concept of RPA and what we do, it's still automation. It's just automating a business process as opposed to a test. Performance indicators within automation solutions will help performance tests. So I'm not saying, and that's one of the things I'm working on, is to make sure that we have performance lead indicators in our automation. I don't run the performance team, but it's more lead indicators to say, hey, by the way, performance team, these screens took this long to load, this API took this long to run. If you want to, FYI, if you want to build some kind of performance tests around that. That's how we're leveraging some AI type capabilities that I'm building in with my team.
You're on time, Jim. I don't know if you want to share any last thoughts, even your contact information for people to connect.
Just a final recap here, and that just kind of touches on what we discussed today. What's changing in software delivery? Look at the 5 trends, stay current with predictions, and build yourself a 1 to 5 year test automation plan with technology and tools leading the way. So with that, I have some of my information here.
Thank you so much, Jim, and everyone who joined. Please remember to fill out the survey. I left 2 links for the speaker and the conference. And it was super exciting to see everything that's happening and what's coming. Funny that I'm also involved in projects to include performance in test automation. Mm-hmm. So that was a coincidence. Please do, reach out to Jim if there were any questions. Sometimes you can share also like a link to a Zoom meeting if there's anything else to discuss. Sure. So everyone is thanking you, Jim, as well in the chat for
Thank you, everyone.
Informative.